In the heart of the ancient Islamic world, at a time when kingdoms rose and fell like the tides of the Nile, one name began to echo with increasing strength across the deserts, mountains, and cities of the Middle East: Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. He was not born to a throne, nor raised in the lap of luxury. He was born in Tikrit, in 1137, under the shadows of war and displacement, during a time when the Muslim world was fractured, each city-state ruled by emirs and sultans more interested in their own power than the plight of the Ummah. Yet even in his youth, there was something in Salahuddin that set him apart: a silent strength, an unwavering gaze, a humility that disarmed even the harshest of critics. As a child, Salahuddin listened to stories of the Prophet Muhammad, of Umar ibn al-Khattab, and of Khalid ibn al-Walid. His heart ached at the state of Jerusalem, the city once graced by prophets, now desecrated by the Crusaders. He did not burn with rage, he burned with resolve. The kind of resolve that is born not from hatred, but from love for justice, for faith, and for unity. His rise was not meteoric, but methodical. Under the mentorship of his uncle Shirkuh, a fierce general in the service of the Zengid ruler Nur ad-Din, Salahuddin learned not just the art of war, but the principles of governance, the value of diplomacy, and the sacredness of intention. When Shirkuh died unexpectedly, Salahuddin, to the surprise of many, was appointed the vizier of Egypt. He was still young, soft-spoken, and unassuming. Many underestimated him. It was their greatest mistake. With strategic brilliance cloaked in humility, Salahuddin consolidated power in Egypt, eliminated corruption, and slowly began building what no one thought possible: unity. His leadership, unlike many of his contemporaries, was not marked by cruelty but by an unmatched sense of justice. He won over enemies with character rather than the sword, and when he did draw his blade, it was only to protect the innocent or defend the honor of Islam. But his heart never forgot Jerusalem. Years passed. Battles were fought. Alliances formed and dissolved. And finally, in 1187, the crescent moon rose over the city once again. The Battle of Hattin had shattered the Crusader forces. Jerusalem, after nearly 9 decades of occupation, opened its gates not to a conqueror, but to a liberator. What happened next would be written not just in books of history, but in the hearts of those who value mercy over vengeance. Unlike the First Crusade, when blood filled the streets and tens of thousands were slaughtered, Salahuddin allowed the Christians of Jerusalem to leave safely, demanding only a modest ransom for each. For those who could not pay, he freed them. Women, children, the elderly, all spared. Churches remained untouched. Religious freedom was upheld. His enemies were stunned. They had come to know Muslims through the brutality of war. But now, through Salahuddin, they saw the essence of Islam: dignity, restraint, honor. Even King Richard the Lionheart, the famed English crusader, could not deny the nobility of Salahuddin. Though they stood on opposing sides of war, Richard wrote of Salahuddin with admiration, calling him the most chivalrous ruler he had ever encountered. Their interactions were marked by mutual respect, and at times, even compassion. When Richard fell ill, Salahuddin sent him his personal physician and a gift of fresh fruits and snow to cool his fever. This was not weakness, it was strength born from character. Yet behind the grandeur of battlefields and the weight of empires, Salahuddin remained a servant of his faith. At night, he would often be found in prayer, forehead on the ground, seeking guidance and forgiveness. His wealth, though vast, was never hoarded. At the time of his death, he had no palace, no gold, and no land to his name. The man who had ruled Egypt, Syria, and Jerusalem died with barely enough money to cover his own burial. But he left behind a legacy that would endure for centuries. He became not just a symbol of military genius, but of spiritual leadership. He reminded the world that a true ruler is not measured by the size of his army, but by the weight of his justice, the clarity of his purpose, and the mercy in his heart. Even today, in the streets of Cairo, the hills of Damascus, and the alleys of Jerusalem, his name is whispered with reverence. Children are taught about his valor. Elders speak of his mercy. Scholars write of his strategy. And believers weep at the memory of a man who reclaimed a city not just with swords, but with soul. But the story does not end here. Salahuddin's soul had left the world, but his spirit had rooted itself in the soil of every land he had touched. His vision of a unified Ummah, guided not merely by political dominion but by the values of compassion, humility, and justice, continued to ripple outward like the echo of a great prayer whispered into the wind. His successors tried to emulate him, but he was a man whose legacy could not be replicated, only honored. Those who had fought against him, the Crusaders who once saw Muslims as nothing but savages and infidels, left the Levant not with tales of a brutal conqueror, but with stories of a man who embodied the highest ideals of humanity. Many knights returned to Europe and spoke not of hatred, but of a strange and haunting admiration. His name became a quiet lesson in Christian courts and royal halls, that even among enemies, honor could rise like dawn over a battlefield. In the Muslim world, Salahuddin was more than a sultan. He became a symbol of what could be achieved when righteousness and leadership met. He was a model for rulers who wished to carry both the Quran and the sword with balance. His rule had not only reclaimed Jerusalem but reignited the flickering flame of Islamic unity. For too long, the Ummah had been splintered by dynastic ambition, petty rivalries, and selfish egos. Salahuddin had cut through this chaos not with tyranny, but with purpose. And that purpose, even after his death, called out to the hearts of those who longed for justice. There was something profoundly magnetic about the way he lived. His soldiers loved him not because he made them rich. Most of them died with less than they'd begun with, but because they knew they followed a man who would never ask them to sacrifice anything he would not offer first. He rode with them into battle, fasted with them during Ramadan, even when the campaign trail was harsh, and when nights were cold in the Syrian hills, he slept on the same rough blankets, refusing the warmth of silk or luxury while his men shivered. He once walked through a camp of wounded soldiers, stopping at each, whispering du'as for their healing. He poured water into the mouths of the injured with his own hands. When his advisors urged him to delegate, he simply said, "If they can bleed for this cause, I can serve them water." Such gestures did not just win loyalty, they won love. But there were shadows, too. For a man like Salahuddin, peace was never permanent. After Jerusalem was retaken, the Christian kingdoms still existed in fragmented pockets across the Levant. The Crusades had not ended, only weakened. Diplomacy was now as important as the sword. Salahuddin, though a seasoned general, found himself playing a more delicate game, balancing truces, securing borders, ensuring supply lines for the cities under his care. Peace, in many ways, required more effort than war. Despite the many victories, there was always a weariness behind his eyes in those final years. Not from defeat, he had not known much of it, but from the sheer weight of responsibility. He had become the moral compass of a fragmented world. Every decision, every alliance, every treaty, was measured against what was right, not merely what was strategic. Yet Salahuddin never claimed to be a saint. He had his moments of temper, he made mistakes, and there were battles that cost more lives than perhaps necessary. But it was the way he responded to his own flaws that defined him. He sought counsel, repented openly when he believed he had erred, and never let arrogance settle in his heart. One evening, shortly after the peace treaty with Richard the Lionheart was signed, Salahuddin stood on the battlements of Jerusalem. The city was calm, its skyline dotted with domes and minarets glowing in the soft amber of twilight. A servant approached with dates and water for iftar. Salahuddin broke his fast in silence, gazing toward Al-Aqsa, then toward the horizon where distant ships could be seen, Crusader vessels retreating west. He turned to his general and said, "They came with fire in their hearts and left with confusion. Perhaps they expected a monster, not men of prayer." The general, a seasoned warrior with scars across his cheek, replied, "They came with crosses and left with questions." Salahuddin smiled faintly. That is the beginning of truth. But peace, as always, was fleeting. New threats emerged from within, ambitious emirs, foreign spies, the whispers of betrayal in cities he had once united. Salahuddin, even in his later years, rode tirelessly between Cairo and Damascus, from Aleppo to Jerusalem, trying to keep the unity he had forged from crumbling under its own weight. He trusted his sons, but they lacked his steel. They were educated, trained, and devout, But the charisma, the spiritual gravity that Salahuddin carried, did not transfer by blood. And this troubled him. He knew dynasties were fragile things, easily broken by ambition and jealousy. His real legacy, he believed, would not be the throne, but the ideal. He gathered his sons one night and said, "Do not fight over my lands. Rule them as trustees. Remember, we are not kings by right, we are servants by duty. If the people remember me, let it be for my justice, not my palace." His eldest, Al-Afdal, nodded solemnly, but Salahuddin's eyes saw the hesitation in the boy's heart. Politics, he knew, had a way of diluting even the most noble intentions. As his health began to decline, Salahuddin withdrew from the political theater and spent more time in reflection. He read the Quran, met with scholars, gave away much of his personal wealth. He ordered his physicians not to prolong his life with artificial means. "If my time has come," he said, "let me meet my Lord without delay." In those final days, he could often be heard whispering verses of the Quran. One morning, a servant found him crying softly while reciting. Whoever does an atom's weight of good will see it, and whoever does an atom's weight of evil will see it. Surah Al-Zalzala. When asked why he wept, Salahuddin replied, "I have ruled kingdoms, led armies, liberated cities, but I do not know if I have even done an atom's weight of good that is pure." Such was the humility of the man whom the world called Sultan al-Adil, the just ruler. When he passed away in Damascus in 1193, the city mourned like a mother who had lost her son. Christians and Jews attended his funeral alongside Muslims. His grave was simple, unadorned, just as he had requested. The man who had held dominion over the richest lands of the Muslim world died with nothing but a sword, a Quran, and a broken heart for the Ummah he could not completely heal. Years later, a sultan of the Ottoman Empire visited Salahuddin's grave and wept. He ordered that a marble dome be built above it, not to glorify the man, but to protect the memory. "This man," he said, "was a mirror of our Prophet's mercy." Even centuries after his death, his name continued to inspire revolts against oppression, revolutions for justice, and reforms in governance. Poets wrote of him as the lion who roared not with rage but with righteousness. Artists painted his battles, not with crimson blood but golden light. Scholars debated his decisions, analyzing each campaign not just for military tactics, but for moral clarity. Yet perhaps the most telling tribute came not from kings or poets, but from an old Jerusalemite woman who, decades after his death, was asked what she remembered of Salahuddin. She replied, "He walked through this city like a shadow, silent, soft, and unseen, but his footsteps are still louder than any who followed. And so, his story lingers, not in ruins or relics, but in the very dust that carries the whispers of justice." Children still grow up hearing his name, not as myth but as a beacon. Imams quote his prayers. Teachers remind their students of his mercy. And in every generation, there are those who, when faced with injustice, ask themselves, what would Salahuddin do? Because his legacy is not just about reclaiming a city. It is about reclaiming the soul of a people. It is about reminding the world that leadership is not about dominion, but about service. Not about power, but about purpose. Salahuddin Ayyubi was not perfect, but in his striving for justice, he reminded humanity of what perfection looks like in the form of effort, intention, and humility. And so his tale is not over, for as long as the world grapples with tyranny, as long as faith is tested, and as long as the call to prayer rises over Jerusalem, Salahuddin's story continues. The sun had long set on the life of Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, but his light had not dimmed, it had only scattered into 1,000 stars, illuminating the skies of history, faith, and moral leadership. His name lives on, not just in dusty manuscripts or marble tombs, but in the pulse of every soul that yearns for justice wrapped in mercy, strength anchored in humility, and power guided by divine purpose. The man who had no throne at birth, who rose not through bloodline but through brilliance and virtue, left behind not an empire of stones, but an empire of hearts. Generations have come and gone. The great castles of the Crusaders have crumbled. The banners of war have fallen. But Salahuddin's legacy marches on like a silent army, carried not by soldiers, but by stories. Not by swords, but by the values he embodied. In a time when men were tempted by greed and glory, he chose honor. In an age of betrayal, he chose trust. And in the darkest corners of conflict, he chose light. Even those who stood against him found themselves spellbound by his character. When King Richard returned to England, he could not erase Salahuddin from his memory. For years, he spoke of the Muslim leader with awe, not for his battlefield victories, but for the extraordinary humanity he had shown amidst the smoke of war. In a world where cruelty was expected and vengeance was the norm, Salahuddin had turned forgiveness into a weapon more powerful than steel. But Salahuddin's greatness did not come from miracles. It came from choices. Every day, he chose restraint when anger beckoned. He chose patience when impatience could have served his ambition. He chose prayer when sleep called him to comfort. He chose to be poor in wealth, so he could be rich in spirit. This was not a saint beyond reach. This was a man who showed us what we are capable of, if we choose courage over convenience, and principles over power. And perhaps, that is what makes his story so eternally relevant. He was not forged by comfort. He was molded by adversity. He did not inherit a united world, he inherited chaos, fragmentation, and despair. But he did not complain. He did not retreat. He rose, with his heart grounded in faith and his vision set far beyond the horizon. He rose because he believed in something larger than himself, a belief in divine justice, in the sacred duty of leadership, and in the unshakable truth that real power is in serving others. As rulers and tyrants faded into the background of forgotten chronicles, Salahuddin's memory soared higher. He became the answer to tyranny, the response to corruption, the antidote to despair. In times when the Muslim world finds itself divided again, his story emerges like a call from the past. Unite, not through fear, but through righteousness. Stand, not for power, but for principle. He lived in an era when leaders would slaughter the innocent to retain power. Yet, Salahuddin would spare even his fiercest enemies to preserve dignity. His enemies marched into war cloaked in crosses, expecting to crush an inferior enemy. They returned home humbled, having witnessed a man who mirrored the teachings of prophets more than generals. To this day, in the narrow streets of Jerusalem, when the Adhan rises above Al-Aqsa and the sun paints gold on ancient stones, there's a whisper in the wind, the echo of a man who once walked there not to conquer, but to restore. A man who shed no innocent blood. A man who forgave when vengeance would have been applauded. A man who could have sat on a throne made of gold, but chose to die with nothing, so his soul could meet his Creator with a heart full of sincerity, not vanity. The children of today are told his name as a story. But make no mistake, Salahuddin was not a tale. He was a test. A test for us to see what we admire, what we remember, and what we strive to become. Do we want leaders who boast and destroy, or do we seek leaders who serve and build? Do we walk in his footsteps only in stories, or do we carry his values into our own lives? Because Salahuddin's greatness is not locked in the past. It is a light, passed down like a torch, and it waits for hands brave enough to carry it forward. Imagine a world where every leader prayed as Salahuddin did. Where every warrior paused to ask whether their cause was just. Where every victory was measured not in territory gained, but in lives protected. This is the world Salahuddin dreamed of. This is the world we still owe him. He fought for Jerusalem, yes, but not just for its land. He fought for its soul, for the peace between its people, for the sanctity of its walls. He did not see Christians, Jews and Muslims as enemies by birth. He saw them as children of the same Creator, misguided by ambition, but redeemable through justice. And in that understanding, he was centuries ahead of his time. His grave lies in Damascus, modest and unmarked by royal excess. But to those who know his story, it is not just a tomb. It is a reminder. A place where time stands still and whispers the secret he lived by. True greatness is not in ruling others, but in mastering oneself. So when you feel overwhelmed by the weight of the world, when you feel that justice is too far, that division is too deep, remember Salahuddin. Not as a warrior mounted on a horse, but as a man who, with each step, carved a path through history using the blade of truth, the shield of prayer, and the armor of humility. And remember, the world does not need another Salahuddin in name. It needs hearts that beat like his, eyes that see as he saw, hands that give as he gave. It needs souls that carry the burden of justice without letting it turn into arrogance. It needs courage, not the kind that charges into war, but the kind that kneels in prayer and rises with clarity. Because the final chapter of Salahuddin's story has not yet been written. It continues in you, in me, in every young soul who chooses truth over trend, who stands up when the world demands silence, who forgives when the world demands revenge, who prays when the world forgets God. That is where Salahuddin lives. Not in history books. Not in stone. But in the fire of faith that still flickers in the hearts of the sincere. So ask yourself, not who was Salahuddin, but what within you is waiting to rise like him? And when that spark ignites, the story continues.